Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never written with permission. In 1845, under the thick, breathless heat of a southern night, a whisper slithered through the slave quarters like a forbidden scripture. They said a man had snapped, not from madness, but from clarity. They said he'd discovered something, a pattern buried beneath cruelty itself. And before dawn, 14 slave masters would hang from the same towering tree, while their wives stood helpless beneath the branches, forced to watch the truth they spent years pretending did not exist. But that's not where the story really begins. It begins deeper, inside the silent architecture of domination. You see, for most men, history is just dates and dust. But for a select few, the ones willing to stare into the abyss with steady eyes, history is a manual, a blueprint, a record of how power was seized, hidden, weaponized, and how, sometimes, it slipped through the cracks. And in 1845, one enslaved man, known only in surviving fragments as Solomon the Quiet, found that crack. He understood something the plantation owners feared more than rebellion, more than escape, more than death itself. He learned the shape of power. Not the kind written in law books or preached from pulpits. No, the real kind. The invisible kind. The psychological sort that trains a population to police itself, to shrink itself, to forget the fire that once lived in its bones. The kind of control that doesn't need chains because it rewires the mind. The plantation system was the perfect laboratory for this. Every rule, every punishment, every whisper of doctrine was engineered to break identity and rebuild obedience. Not just physical domination, identity engineering. And Solomon watched. He watched the masters, their habits, their patterns. He watched the overseers. He watched the wives, those quiet architects of plantation order, pretending innocence while reinforcing the system with a smile. But most importantly, he watched the cracks in the facade. He realized the truth no enslaver could imagine. The system wasn't unbreakable. It was predictable. And predictable things can be dismantled. On the final night before the uprising, a candle flickered in the quarters, just once, in a precise rhythm. To anyone else, it meant nothing. But to those who'd been silently studying the same patterns, it was the signal. The illusion was over. What unfolded next would be wiped from most records, buried behind official narratives, and softened into rumor. But what truly happened was something far more dangerous, far more revealing. When you're ready, we go deeper. By the time the moon climbed above the cypress trees, the plantation was already breathing differently. Like the land itself sensed what the humans upon it refused to acknowledge. The wind moved in strange currents, soft but deliberate, brushing against the slave quarters as if urging them forward. And deep inside that wooden labyrinth of whispered grievances and silent calculations, Solomon the Quiet rose to his feet. He was not the loudest man, nor the strongest. But he possessed something far more unsettling to an empire built on domination. He could see through people, through their pretenses, through their performances, through the masks that made cruelty look like order. He had spent years watching the masters rehearse the same lies, years studying how fear was administered like a medicine, measured, timed, disguised as structure. Years learning how the wives manipulated the emotional architecture of the plantation, maintaining harmony among the enslavers while tightening the psychological chains around the enslaved. And he knew, this wasn't just brutality. It was a program. Fear was the first layer. Isolation was the second. Identity fracture was the third. And the final layer, the one no one talks about, was ritual. Because every oppressive system relies on ritual. Patterns. Repetition. Predictability disguised as fate. Every Sunday sermon reinforcing divine hierarchy. Every chore assigned within a rigid order. Every supper bell ringing like a small commandment. Every punishment performed publicly to reinforce the myth of omnipotence. Solomon understood something most free men still don't today. Institutions don't survive because they are powerful. They survive because they are believed. Break belief, and the entire structure collapses like wet paper. So Solomon didn't plan his uprising the way most rebels do, with rage as the engine. He planned it like a surgeon. He mapped the routines of each of the 14 masters. He noted who drank themselves numb, who wandered at night, who trusted their dogs more than their men. He tracked their wives, the ones who quietly selected which enslaved children would be disciplined harder, whose gossip shaped the plantation's hierarchy more than any whip. And on the night of the revolt, He used the enslaver's own rituals against them. The masters followed their habitual path toward the northern fields, expecting obedience, expecting the usual nighttime stillness. What they walked into instead was a recalibrated version of their own system, a structure rebuilt not for control, but for reversal. The illusion they depended on had been shattered, and in its place stood something they could never imagine, men who no longer believed in Fae. They say the first sound was not a scream, but a silence so sharp, so absolute. It felt like the entire plantation inhaled at once and forgot how to exhale. And in that silence, as the masters stepped into the northern field with the confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable, Solomon stood waiting, still, unblinking, as if he had already seen this moment play out 1,000 times in the theater of his mind. Behind him were men whose spirits had been starved but never extinguished. Men who had lived inside a psychological cage so tight it stole the shape of their own names. Men who, for the first time in their lives, were not acting out of fear, but out of clarity. Not chaos, structure. Not vengeance, correction. Solomon had told them earlier that day. Every system reveals its weakness the moment it becomes predictable. And the masters were nothing if not predictable. They walked the same route. They carried the same rifles. They barked the same orders at the same moment every night. They believed in their own mythology so deeply that the idea of danger simply did not exist for them. That arrogance was the chasm Solomon stepped through. When the overseer raised his lantern, expecting to see the familiar rows of cotton, he instead saw torches. Dozens of them, lit and planted in deliberate lines, forming a pattern he did not recognize. A symbol older than the plantation system, older than the country itself, something etched into the collective memory of people who had been forced to forget where they came from. The overseer froze. The masters behind him muttered. Confusion rippled like static through their ranks. And Solomon stepped forward. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low, so low it forced the men to lean in, as if gravity itself wanted them to. Hey, you built this world on rituals, he said, but you never understood them. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't raging. He was unveiling. Because what terrified the enslavers was not the uprising. It was the realization that the men they believed they owned had been studying them with forensic precision. That the same psychological strategies used to control the enslaved had been mirrored, inverted, and turned back upon the enslavers themselves. In that moment, the masters understood something that no chronicle, no official history book, no sanitized classroom lesson would ever admit. Power is never truly lost in the oppressed. It is only stored, accumulated, waiting. And on that night, it came due. The masters didn't realize it yet, but by the time Solomon stepped toward them, the outcome was already sealed. Power doesn't shift in the moment of the strike. It shifts in the moment one side stops believing in the myth that kept them obedient. And belief had already bled out of the enslaved hours before the first torch was lit. Solomon could see it in their eyes. A new stillness, a new density, a new gravitational pull inside every man who stood behind him. This wasn't adrenaline. This wasn't frenzy. This was identity returning home. He had spent months preparing them, not by demanding loyalty, but by restoring something the plantation tried to annihilate. In a structure, he taught them to breathe in unison, to move without sound, to recognize each other's footsteps in total darkness, to read rhythms, not words, to use silence as a language. That night, they didn't just rebel, they synchronized. The masters, meanwhile, were unraveling, because nothing terrifies a tyrant more than calm resistance. Shouting they can handle, begging they can handle, even rage they can predict. But calm, deliberate, wordless calm, that's the sign of a mind that has already stepped out of their control. When Solomon raised his hand, every enslaved man behind him stepped forward in perfect unity, the kind of coordination the plantation had never once achieved in its entire existence. The overseer instinctively reached for his rifle, but before he could aim, 3 men emerged from the darkness behind him. Their steps were so soft that even the dogs hadn't barked. It wasn't brute force that froze the masters in place. It was the dawning horror that they were outmaneuvered, outthought, outprepared, outsmarted by the very people they believed incapable of strategy. The wives, still inside the main house, had no idea what was happening, yet even they sensed something shifting in the air, a tremor in the unseen architecture that had always kept them safe. They were the silent engineers of obedience, the ones who whispered cruelty into protocol. But none of that mattered now, because Solomon had attacked the root, not the branches, the psychology, not the flesh. Then Solomon spoke again, and his words fell with the quiet finality of a verdict. Tonight is not vengeance. It is revelation. The masters flinched, not because of volume, but because of certainty. They were staring at men who no longer feared them, men who had pulled themselves out of the psychological pit the plantation had dug for them. And once a man rises from that depth, you cannot put him back. The masters saw the ropes before they understood the meaning behind them. Thick hemp coils hung from the branches of the great oak at the center of the northern field, a tree they had walked past 1,000 times without ever noticing its weight, its silence, its age. They thought it belonged to them, like everything else. But tonight, it belonged to memory. Tonight, it belonged to truth. Solomon didn't gesture toward the ropes. He didn't need to. The symbolism was enough to make the oldest master stumble backward, his boots sinking into the damp soil as if the ground itself rejected him. "You always believed the world was shaped for you," Solomon said quietly. "But the world was only patient with you." One of the younger masters, the one who spent years boasting about how order must be maintained, stepped forward, trying to salvage authority. His voice cracked when he shouted, "Why, you'll be punished for this. The law." Solomon cut him off with a single look. Not aggressive, not triumphant, just a gaze carved from someone who had finally peeled the last layer of illusion off the world. "The law," Solomon repeated. "The law is just fear written down." The masters swallowed hard. Every oppressive system relies on this one belief, that the consequences of rebellion are worse than the consequences of obedience. But once men decide they'd rather die standing than live kneeling, the psychological grip dissolves instantly. This is why Solomon prepared them for months, not to fight, but to shift their inner axis, to detach from the plantation's emotional gravity, to become unmoved by threats that once shaped their entire existence. Because the truth is simple: what enslaves a man's body is secondary. What enslaves his mind is primary. Solomon turned his back on the masters, not arrogantly, but with the calm certainty of someone who no longer recognized their authority. He walked toward the tree, placed his hand on its trunk, and whispered something the others couldn't hear. Whether it was a prayer, a promise, or a memory, no one knew. Behind him, the men who had once been broken into obedient fragments now stood whole, every breath aligned, every step grounded in a new internal structure. And the wives inside the house, they felt it. Even before a single rope tightened, they sensed the collapse of the invisible hierarchy they had spent years maintaining through subtle cruelty and quiet manipulation. The plantation's greatest lie had finally shattered. Power was never in the hands of the masters. It was only borrowed. The wives heard the first break in the night, the sound of something shifting outside, something that didn't belong to the usual script of plantation order. They paused mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-breath. For years, they had lived as the hidden architects of this place, shaping its cruelty through gentleness, shaping its discipline through suggestion, whispering fear into procedures while keeping their own hands spotless. But tonight, the air felt different. Heavier, lower, like a curtain of truth was finally being pulled open. One wife stepped out onto the porch, lantern trembling in her grip. She expected to see the usual glow of her husband's patrol. Instead, she saw torches, too many, too still, arranged in cold symmetry. She felt something primal tighten in her chest. Not guilt, not remorse, just the fear that comes when a person realizes the game they thought they were controlling was never theirs. Meanwhile, at the oak, the masters were beginning to understand the structure of what stood before them. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a riot. This was a systemic reversal. Every position, every angle, every step had been planned. Solomon had mirrored the plantation's own hierarchy, only inverted. The men, who had once been forced to stand below, now stood above. The ones who once obeyed now commanded. And the ones who once believed themselves untouchable felt the cold breath of reality crawling down their spine. One of the older wives finally stepped down from the porch, calling out into the night, "Thomas." Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual superiority. No answer, because the men she had helped shape into quiet tyrants were no longer standing in the world she recognized. They were inside Solomon's architecture now, a world where fear didn't flow downward anymore. It flowed upward. In front of the tree, The masters attempted to negotiate. They begged. They threatened. They issued commands out of pure habit, as if their voices alone could still reach into the minds of the men they'd broken for years. But their words bounced off a wall they couldn't see. These men were no longer inside the plantation's psychological system. They had stepped out of it. And once a man steps out of a false world, nothing inside it can command him again. Solomon finally spoke, not to the masters, but to the wives whose eyes were now fixed on the scene unfolding before them. You taught them how to hurt without lifting a finger, he said. Tonight, you will learn how power returns to those it never left. The wives froze. This was the moment they realized the truth they had spent their lives avoiding. You cannot manipulate a man who no longer fears the world that made him. The wives stepped closer to the field, lanterns shaking as the flames cast long, trembling shadows across the ground, distorted silhouettes of a hierarchy collapsing in real time. For the first time, the structures they had depended on, the routines, the commands, the polished rituals of control, were gone. Not broken. Gone. As if uprooted from the air itself. And deep inside, each woman felt something colder than fear, recognition. A quiet, sinking admission that the order they believed eternal was nothing more than a carefully tended illusion. At the tree, the masters were unraveling. The bravest among them tried to speak, but his voice cracked under the weight of a truth he could no longer outrun. We can fix this, he stammered. Solomon, listen. Just stop this before it's too late. But Solomon did not honor him with a direct reply. He turned slightly, just enough so the torchlight framed his profile, and he spoke to the enslaved men behind him. You see, even now, they negotiate from the throne they think they still sit on. The men nodded, not with anger, but with understanding. They'd watched this same performance all their lives. The remorse that blooms only when consequences arrive. The appeals to humanity from those who denied it to others. The sudden politeness of tyrants whose certainty has collapsed. Solomon lifted his hand, and the men stepped forward, forming a circle around the masters. Not touching them, not grabbing them, just containing them, physically, mentally, symbolically. A ring of reclaimed identity tightening like a noose around the plantation's lost illusions of authority. The wives watched, breathless, struggling to comprehend the geometry of what they were seeing. This wasn't punishment. It was design, a reordering, a reversal crafted with the same precision the plantation once used to enforce its rules. Solomon walked slowly around the masters, each step deliberate. His presence felt less like a man and more like a verdict, something ancient, something that had waited through generations of silence. When a system teaches itself invincible, he murmured, it forgets to guard its own shadow. One wife covered her mouth with trembling hands. She understood. All the whispered cruelty, the polite manipulation, the soft violence woven into domestic conversations, none of it protected them anymore. The structure that carried those quiet knives had collapsed beneath their feet. Solomon finally stopped walking. He faced the wives directly, eyes steady, voice low enough to make them lean in. You built your lives on a lie, he said. Tonight, you will witness the truth that waited beneath it. Behind him, the enslaved men tightened the circle, and for the first time in their lives, the wives saw the true cost of the system they upheld, not in ledger books or whispers, but in the firelit eyes of the men they once believed were broken. The circle closed in, not violently, not chaotically, but with the quiet, terrifying precision of men who finally understood the architecture of their own power. The masters huddled together like cattle, stripped of the arrogance that once filled their voices. Their breaths were sharp and uneven, the sound of men tasting fear in its purest, undiluted form for the first time. The wives stood frozen at the edge of the field, watching a reality they never believed possible. Their lanterns flickered against their trembling wrists as the torchlight carved every emotion onto their faces, shock, disbelief, and beneath it all, an old truth they had buried so deep it no longer had a name. Because somewhere inside, they always knew this day could come. They just prayed it never would. Solomon stepped forward again, but this time he spoke softly, so softly the night itself seemed to lean in to listen. You mistook patience for weakness, he said. You mistook silence for acceptance, and you mistook obedience for belief. The masters flinched, because that was their greatest fear spoken aloud, that their entire world rested not on divine order, not on bloodlines, not on law, but on the belief of the people they oppressed. If belief dies, the system dies with it. One of the wives whispered to another, "Why aren't they attacking? Why aren't they doing anything?" Solomon heard her. He turned his head just enough for his voice to reach her. "Because we learned from you." The words hit the wives like a blade made of truth. "We watched how you maintained control without needing to strike. How you rewired fear into routine. How you used silence to punish, order to control, faith to imprison. So tonight, we use your own architecture, your own methods, your own rituals." He raised his hand, and the circle of men opened at a single point, creating a narrow path toward the tree. The masters saw it and understood. This was not a frenzy. This was not rage. This was a deliberate, systematic dismantling of a hierarchy that had stood for generations. One of the younger masters, a man who had never endured hardship a day in his life, fell to his knees. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't. I just followed what I was taught." Solomon crouched before him, meeting his eyes with an expression devoid of hatred or pity. "And that," he said, "is the most dangerous kind of obedience." The wives gasped, because they heard themselves in that sentence. Every time they enforced a rule without thinking. Every time they allowed cruelty because it wasn't their place to question. Every time they shaped the plantation's brutality through quiet complicity. Solomon stood, his shadow long and unwavering. "Tonight," he said, "every mask falls." The circle tightened again. The wives clutched each other, and the tree, silent for decades, seemed to wait for what came next. The wives stepped closer to the tree, unable to stop themselves. Some instinct, something older than their upbringing, older than their marriage vows, older even than the plantation's rituals, pulled them forward. Terror, yes, but also something else. The dawning realization that they were about to witness the collapse of a world they had helped build, brick by brick, rule by rule, whisper by whisper. The torches burned brighter now, casting jagged halos of firelight across the field. The shadows danced across the faces of the enslaved men, but their expressions didn't change. They were steady, grounded, transforming, as if they had already crossed a threshold the wives couldn't even see. Solomon raised one of the ropes, not like a weapon, but like a symbol. "You used this," he said quietly, "to teach Faye." One of the wives shook her head violently. No, it wasn't me," she stammered. "I never touched a rope. I never." "You didn't need to," Solomon replied without taining. "You only had to approve of the silence that followed it." The words hit her with the force of an axe. She staggered, nearly dropping her lantern as the truth slammed into her. She had never punished anyone herself, but she had nodded. She had looked away. She had allowed. Complicity is never loud. Often, it was a polite smile. Solomon let the rope fall back against the tree, and the sound, soft, almost gentle, hit the masters harder than any shout. He stepped aside, and the men behind him moved into position with the precision of a ritual. Not the plantation's ritual. Their own. The masters knew now that no plea would matter. They tried anyway, clinging to the final remnants of a belief system that no longer existed. "We can change. We didn't know. We can fix this. We weren't all the same." Every excuse sounded like a child's lie spoken by grown men who had never been denied anything in their lives. But it was the wives who broke first. One of them stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Solomon, please. We were wrong. I see that now. But this will haunt you. You'll become the very thing you hate." It was a desperate attempt, a psychological tactic disguised as concern, something she had done before, many times, to guide her husband's cruelty with the gentlest touch. She didn't know how else to control a narrative. But Solomon did not bend. He looked at her with a clarity that cut through every layer of manipulation. "You mistake justice for corruption," he said. "The system that shaped your fear of consequence is the same system that shaped your power. Without it, you stand naked." Her face collapsed. Because that was the truth she had been running from. Her identity existed only inside the plantation's artificial hierarchy. Without it, she was not powerful. She was simply human. Behind her, the other wives clutched their skates, their rosaries, their breaths. Their world wasn't tilting. It was evaporating. Solomon turned his gaze back to the men behind him. "In every age," he said, "there comes a night when the oppressed stop praying for mercy. and start remembering who they were before the chains. The circle moved. The ropes swayed in the torchlight, and the descent continued. The ropes swayed like silent metronomes, measuring the heartbeat of a world about to end. The master stared at them with a hollow dread, the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't thrash, doesn't fight. The kind that only appears when a man finally understands the one truth he spent his whole life running from. Power is borrowed. Accountability is inevitable. The wives stood several paces behind the circle, their lanterns shaking like failing stars. Everything they believed, their status, their privilege, their untouchable place in the hierarchy, was dissolving right in front of them. Not slowly, not symbolically, but suddenly, like a curtain set on fire. Solomon moved with unhurried steps. Not a man preparing violence, a man restoring balance. You shaped this world with rules, he said, not raising his voice. You built it on obedience, on silence, on repetition. So now you will stand inside the rules you made. The wives watched him, trembling. They had never seen him speak this much, never seen him lead, never seen him anything but quiet. Now the quiet had turned into something else, a force, a presence, a gravity. One master tried to grab Solomon's arm in a burst of desperate instinct, but before his fingers could close, two men stepped in, gripping him firmly. There was no brutality, no frenzy, just control, precision, containment. The wives gasped as the master was pinned, not struck, not beaten, just restrained. It was the restraint that terrified the most. It meant the enslaved men were not acting out of madness. They were acting out of will. Solomon looked at the master on the ground and spoke in a tone that could have belonged to a stained teacher correcting a foolish student. You mistake panic for innocence. You mistake fear for transformation. He leaned down slightly, meeting the master's eyes. You are not sorry for what you did. You are sorry for being caught. The master's mouth trembled. He had no answer. Solomon rose again, turning to the wives. 4 years, you whispered cruelty into the walls. You measured punishments. You approved the rituals that broke men, women, and children. You refined the system with a softer voice, but you still refined it. One wife shook her head, tears falling. We were trying to survive our own expectations, our own roles. Solomon cut in gently. You were not powerless. You were comfortable. The wives collapsed into silence. Because that was the truth they feared most. They weren't trapped by the system. They were supported by it. And comfort breeds blindness deeper than chains ever could. Solomon took one step toward them. You will not be touched, he said. Your punishment is to witness what power looks like when it returns to its rightful owners. The wives' breaths caught. Witnessing was worse than pain. Witnessing meant they could never unsee it. Witnessing meant their illusions would never regrow. Behind Solomon, the men approached the tree in synchronized steps, each movement heavy with meaning, with history, with the weight of generations watching through time. A storm was coming. Not of weather, of revelation. The tree loomed above them all, an ancient sentinel that had watched generations of cruelty unfold beneath its branches. Tonight, it bore witness to something far older than the plantation, far older than the nation itself, a reckoning written in the silence of men who had once been broken. The ropes hung like quiet judges, waiting for the moment when history would reclaim itself. Solomon gestured, and the men fell into precise positions. There was no chaos in their movement. Every step, every turn, every glance had been rehearsed in the shadows, in whispers, in secret rituals. They were not rebels. They were architects of inevitability. The masters, kneeling and trembling, could only watch. Their bravado had evaporated. Their threats had no purchase. Their authority had been dismantled without a single strike. The truth was now unavoidable. The power they wielded was never theirs to keep. The wives, lanterns held tight, finally found their voices, but only to whisper. It cannot end this way, one said, her tone shaking. It must not. Solomon's eyes swept over them, calm but unyielding. It ends the way it always should. Not with vengeance, not with hate, with recognition. The system that built you, that gave you comfort, that taught you how to command, now unravels before your eyes. And you must watch, because witnessing is part of your reckoning. He turned to the men behind him. Do not falter. Do not hesitate. Precision is your shield. Clarity is your sword. And then it began. The first master was hoisted, not by brute force, but with calculated leverage and synchronization. The ropes pulled taut until he was suspended, weightless, exposed. His face was pale, and in his eyes, the realization came fully. The life he had commanded, the life he had believed in, was gone. The wives gasped, some covering their mouths, others staring with wide, unblinking eyes. They had never seen fear this pure. Fear that was not performative. Fear that arose from the understanding of immutable truth. The second master followed, then the third, each lifted in perfect cadence, each facing the wives and the sky together. 14 men in total, swinging silently in the torchlight, a grim orchestra orchestrated by the very men they had tried to control. Solomon's voice broke the night again. Every system has a spine. Tonight, you see it bend, not by brute force, but by intelligence, by understanding, by refusal to believe lies anymore. And in that moment, the wives understood fully. The illusion of hierarchy had been a cage for everyone. And now, the cage was gone. Solomon looked at the men behind him. Remember this night. Every lesson, every betrayal, every subtle cruelty. Let it burn in you. Not for vengeance, but for clarity. The world bends for those who understand it. The tree loomed above, silent and eternal, as the first rope swayed with a deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat restored to a land that had forgotten itself. The tree stood as a silent witness, its branches stretched wide like the arms of fate itself, and beneath it, 14 men dangled, not in chaos, not in fury, but in the absolute clarity of consequence. Each rope held more than flesh. It held the accumulated weight of generations, the invisible chains of obedience, the rituals that had bound bodies and minds for decades. And now, in this quiet thunder of revelation, those chains had snapped, not by violence alone, but by comprehension. Solomon watched the faces of the enslaved men behind him. They were transformed, not merely by the act, but by understanding the architecture of power they had inherited and now reclaimed. Every muscle, every breath, every deliberate stance spoke of a shift so profound it was almost sacred. They had been disciplined into fear their entire lives. But now, fear served no one. Obedience had become autonomy. Survival had become mastery. The wives looked on, stunned, as if the torches illuminated not just the field, but every hidden truth they had spent their lives suppressing. Their beauty, their refinement, their polite cruelty, all of it collapsed under the weight of seeing men they had tried to control reclaim themselves in perfect rhythm and calculated precision. One could almost see the ghost of the plantation's ideology peeling from their shoulders. Solomon spoke again, his voice low but piercing, carrying across the field like a prophecy. You thought you controlled the flow of life here. You structured it with law, with ritual, with silence. You orchestrated obedience and called it civilization. But civilization is never made. It is borrowed. And tonight, it returns to its rightful owners. The men behind him shifted slightly, forming a tighter formation. They didn't speak, they didn't shout. They moved with the gravity of inevitability. The air itself seemed to bend around them. The masters hung there, powerless, the illusion of authority now a distant memory dangling above the earth. Solomon turned to the wives once more. What you are witnessing is not cruelty, not vengeance, not punishment. It is revelation. You will carry it with you for the rest of your lives. You will not forget what obedience built, and you will not forget what understanding destroyed. A hush fell. The wind stirred the branches above, rustling the leaves like whispered voices of the past. It was a symphony of memory, of injustice, of truth finally spoken aloud. And in that quiet, the wives saw themselves, not as arbiters of power, but as spectators to a force they had never truly known. The ropes swayed gently, casting moving shadows across the field. The men hanging there were no longer victims nor villains. They were symbols. Symbols of a structure reclaimed, of identity restored, of intelligence applied to a system designed to break them. Solomon stepped forward, placing a hand on the trunk of the tree, as if grounding himself in the enduring witness of the earth. Remember this night, he said, for it will teach you more than obedience ever could. The night held its breath. Not a single creature stirred in the fields beyond the tree, as if the world itself had paused to witness the unraveling of a system centuries in the making. The 14 masters swung silently, their bodies trembling with more than physical strain. They bore the weight of their own ignorance, the unbearable gravity of realizing they had never truly controlled anyone. Their power, meticulously constructed over years, had always been borrowed, and now it had evaporated like mist before dawn. The wives, frozen at the edge of the torchlight, finally began to understand the invisible mechanisms they had wielded. Every whispered suggestion, every manipulation disguised as kindness, every soft smile that enforced obedience, they had been architects of psychological control, cogs in a system far larger than their own lives. And tonight, they were spectators to its collapse. Solomon's voice cut through the heavy air, low and steady, carrying authority without aggression. Men think they rule the world when they control bodies. But what enslaves is not the hand, it is the mind. You, and those like you, built a machine that believed fear could substitute for understanding. Tonight, you see what happens when the mind awakens. The enslaved men shifted slightly, each movement synchronized like a silent ritual long rehearsed in their imagination. Their calm was a declaration, a proof that the architects of fear could be dismantled without a single shout or act of rage. They had become a living embodiment of strategy, patience, and clarity, and the masters knew, in the marrow of their bones, that this was no ordinary rebellion. This was systemic inversion. One of the younger masters, pale and shaking, tried to speak. We can fix this. Please, I beg you. His words faltered against the weight of inevitability. Solomon's gaze met his, unwavering. You cannot fix what you never understood, he said. Your authority was a house built on borrowed belief, and belief has been returned. The wives gasped. Some covered their faces, some gripped each other's hands. Their own complicity, their hidden roles, had finally been illuminated. They had been invisible enforcers, silent architects of cruelty, yet powerless when the machinery they maintained was turned back upon itself. Witnessing it was a punishment in itself, a psychological reordering far more absolute than any whip could deliver. Solomon's eyes swept across the field. History has always been written by the powerful, he murmured. But every so often, the powerless remember. Every so often, they rise, not in fury, but in understanding. And when they do, the record changes. The ropes creaked softly in the night breeze, swinging in deliberate cadence, a rhythm of justice, a pulse of recognition. The torchlight cast elongated shadows across the field, stretching like the long arms of time itself, connecting the past with the present, the silence of centuries with the awareness of this single night. And in that rhythm, the wives, the masters, and even the land itself understood. The old order had ended. A new structure had been revealed, not in chaos, but in precision, in understanding, in the reclamation of what had never truly been lost. The wives could barely stand. Their bodies trembled, but it was not from the cold night air. It was from the unbearable gravity of seeing power redefined before them. Every rope, every swing of the hanging masters, every precise motion of the men who had been enslaved, carried a language they had never been taught, the language of reclaimed authority. It was terrifying because it was not arbitrary. It was methodical. It was inevitable. And it left no room for denial. Solomon's voice broke the silence again, calm but unwavering. You see these men? You believed they were powerless. You shaped their lives with your rules, with your silence, with your rituals of faith. But power does not reside in what you control. Power resides in what you understand. And they understand it now. One of the wives whispered under her breath, This cannot be happening. They are children. But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late for lies. The men before her were no longer children. They were adults who had reclaimed the essence of themselves that the plantation sought to fracture. Their mastery was not physical. It was psychological, strategic, immutable. Solomon moved to the center of the circle, his presence anchoring the field like a magnet drawing every eye toward him. Every system has a skeleton, he said. Every institution, every hierarchy, every chain of command rests on bones unseen. Tonight, you see those bones. And you see what happens when the flesh built upon them forgets how to obey. The masters hanging from the ropes began to sway slightly, their bodies straining against the cords. But their struggle was not against the men below. It was against the realization that obedience had never guaranteed safety, that rituals and rules could be turned inside out, that the illusion of control could be dismantled by precision, patience, and comprehension. The wives stepped closer, drawn by something they could not name. Their hands clutched each other. Their faces were pale, drenched in a mixture of awe and terror. They had been silent participants, passive enforcers of a machine they thought eternal. And now, they were witnesses to its undoing. Solomon's gaze swept over the men behind him. "Do not hesitate," he said. "Every movement is deliberate. Every breath is part of the lesson. Let the rhythm remind you of what was taken, and what is now reclaimed." The wind whispered through the branches, brushing against ropes and torches alike. It was a sound older than the plantation, older than the men hanging from the tree, a reminder that power is cyclical, that oppression is temporary, and that awareness can never be chained. In that instant, everyone present understood a truth too dangerous to ignore. Control is never absolute. It is borrowed, and those who learn to read the system can reclaim it with a precision the oppressors never imagined. The torches flickered, casting grotesque, elongated shadows of the hanging masters across the field. Every shadow was a lesson, every sway of the rope a punctuation mark in a story that had been hidden for decades. The wives could no longer look away. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, drank in the scene like witnesses to an unrecorded history, a history that no book, no preacher, no official ledger would ever admit. Solomon moved among the men behind him, his presence a living rhythm, a command without force. "Observe," he said. "This is what power looks like when it is reclaimed, when understanding replaces fear, when patience becomes precision. Watch, and remember." The men nodded, silent but fully present. They were no longer mere survivors, they were architects of inevitability. Every breath, every stance, every coordinated movement conveyed a message the masters and their wives could not deny. Obedience is never permanent. Control is never absolute. Every hierarchy has a breaking point, and tonight, they were witnessing it. One of the wives whispered, trembling, They've become something else. Something organized." She could not articulate the terror she felt, the terror that came from seeing the powerless seize clarity, not through rage, but through comprehension. "Yes," Solomon said, his voice low and deliberate, "and you will remember this. You will repeat it to yourselves every day for the rest of your lives, because understanding is the only true power, and the men before you now possess it fully." The first master let out a low groan as the ropes held him suspended, his muscles screaming against the tension. But it was not fear of death that gripped him, it was the terror of truth. The realization that everything he had believed about authority, obedience, and loyalty had been an illusion, that all the rituals he relied upon to maintain control were now inverted, weaponized by the very people he sought to dominate. The wives instinctively recoiled, clutching one another. Their complicity, their hidden authority, their whispered commands, all of it was rendered meaningless. They had shaped the system, yes, but they could not control the consequences when the system turned its logic back on itself. Solomon turned to them, eyes sharp. "You see now," he said, "that comfort is a cage. That silence is a prison. That power is not what you take. It is what you understand and wield with intention. The lessons of tonight are yours to carry." A sudden gust of wind swept through the field, rustling the leaves and making the ropes sway gently. It was as if nature itself was participating in the reckoning, reminding everyone present that no human system, no matter how rigid, could defy the truths written into the world. And in that quiet, every soul present understood something profound. The old order was dead. The illusion of control was shattered. And the mind, once awakened, cannot be imprisoned again. The men behind Solomon shifted slightly, closing ranks with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial. There was no anger in their movements, no chaos, only purpose. Every gesture, every step, every silent glance carried the weight of accumulated knowledge, knowledge born from decades of suffering, observation, and quiet strategy. This was not vengeance. This was inevitability. The wives stood frozen, lanterns trembling in their hands. Some clutched each other, while others buried their faces, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to fully witness the mechanics of power unraveling before them. And yet, their curiosity, the primal instinct to see the consequences of the world they had helped maintain, drew them forward inch by inch. Solomon's voice cut through the silence, calm, unwavering, and deadly precise. Every system relies on predictability. Every tyrant relies on obedience. And every hierarchy relies on belief. Break belief, and the structure collapses under its own weight. He stepped closer to the tree, letting his hand brush against its rough bark, as if acknowledging a witness older than humanity itself. The 14 masters swayed above, suspended not just by ropes, but by the weight of truth finally pressing down on them. The torches flickered, casting the swinging shadows like specters of authority finally broken. You built this world on faith, rituals, and obedience, Solomon continued, his gaze sweeping over the wives. And you, who thought yourselves invisible, maintained it. But authority is never absolute. It is temporary. It is borrowed. And tonight, it is returned to those it never left. He turned to the men behind him, his voice lowering into a commanding cadence. This is your moment. Not to destroy, but to demonstrate. Every step, every breath, every motion must remind them that what they relied upon is gone. Forever. The men moved, not in frenzy, but in unison. They circled the tree, each movement choreographed to convey clarity and control. The masters, suspended above, could only watch as the very architecture of dominance they had taken for granted was inverted. The illusions of hierarchy, authority, and power were revealed as fragile constructs, collapsing under the weight of comprehension. The wives gasped, some whispering prayers, some unable to speak at all. For the first time, they understood that the consequences of complicity are not always physical. Sometimes, the punishment is witnessing, bearing witness to the unraveling of a system they helped sustain, powerless to intervene, unable to reverse what had been set in motion. And Solomon, standing at the center of the circle, allowed the moment to stretch, letting the weight of inevitability settle over everyone present. The rope swayed gently. The torches flickered. The air vibrated with understanding. The night was quiet, but not peaceful. The silence was thick, charged with the energy of revelation. Every rope that held a master aloft seemed to vibrate with centuries of hidden knowledge, a testament to the fact that what had been stolen could be retained. The men behind Solomon moved in calculated rhythm, each step a deliberate assertion of autonomy, each breath a statement that they had reclaimed what was never truly theirs to lose. The wives were rooted to the spot, lanterns casting anxious shadows across their faces. They had spent their lives believing themselves untouchable, believing that subtlety and soft cruelty could replace force. But as they watched the men's movements, precise and controlled, they felt the invisible structures they relied upon disintegrate. Their power, derived from the plantation's twisted rituals and silent enforcements, now seemed meaningless, fragile, and irrelevant. Solomon's voice rose, measured and deliberate, echoing against the oak and through the night. You thought obedience was permanent. You thought fear was unbreakable. You were wrong. Every system bends to understanding. Every hierarchy collapses when its patterns are reversed. And tonight, the world bends to clarity. A younger master, still swinging gently above, tried to speak, to beg, to reason. But his words were hollow, meaningless. No one heard them. The men behind Solomon did not flinch. They did not shout. They simply maintained their positions, the calmness of their presence a more powerful weapon than any whip or gun. The wives began to murmur among themselves, quietly, as if speaking to the night could shield them from the truth. We built this. We maintained it. How could this happen? But the answers were impossible. No explanation could absolve them. They had been silent architects of a system that now refused to obey them. Solomon approached the tree again, and tracing the course back, grounding himself in the permanence of nature amidst the impermanence of human control. Every institution, he said, every law, every ritual, every whispered command exists only as long as belief persists. Once belief dies, the structure collapses. And tonight, belief dies here. Forever. The torches flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the field. The ropes swayed in unison, each motion a metronome marking the cadence of inevitable consequence. The men behind Solomon exhaled slowly, as if drawing in not just air, but the authority of centuries restored. And in the silence, the wives realized something they could never unlearn. You cannot manipulate a mind that no longer fears you. You cannot enforce obedience on those who have remembered themselves. And you cannot escape the consequences of the system you helped sustain. The ropes swayed like pendulums of fate, each movement precise, deliberate, a rhythm older than any law the plantation had ever enforced. The masters hung suspended, their bodies trembling not from pain, but from the inexorable weight of recognition. They understood now that every act of cruelty, every enforced obedience, every silent acquiescence they had commanded over decades had been recorded, not in ink, but in the minds of those they sought to dominate. And tonight, the ledger was being balanced. The wives clutched each other, lanterns flickering as the shadows danced across their faces. Every careful gesture, every whispered manipulation, every subtle enforcement of hierarchy, they had relied on these invisible levers to maintain control. And yet, all of it had failed, undone by men who had studied the patterns, mastered them, and turned them inward with lethal precision. Solomon's voice cut through the night, calm, deliberate, and unnervingly measured. Power is never given. Power is never permanent. Power exists only in understanding, and only those who comprehend the system can truly wield it. Obedience is not a law, it is a choice. And tonight, that choice has been reclaimed. He moved among the men behind him, each step a reminder of discipline, each glance a signal of precision. The masters, dangling above, tried to speak, tried to negotiate, tried to appeal to whatever fragment of authority remained within them. But their voices were drowned by the quiet certainty of those who had reclaimed themselves. There was no violence here, no frenzy, only a terrifying, methodical reordering of the hierarchy. One of the wives whispered to another, barely audible, "They've become something beyond control, something organized." And in that realization, terror seeped into her bones. It was not just fear, it was awe. The understanding that the men who had been oppressed were no longer bound by the illusions of the plantation, no longer constrained by the psychological chains that had held them in place. Solomon stepped closer to the hanging masters, his shadow long and commanding in the torchlight. "This is not vengeance," he said. "It is demonstration. Every movement, every breath, every action is a lesson in what happens when understanding replaces fear, when clarity replaces obedience, and when knowledge becomes authority." The wind rustled the branches above, lifting the ropes gently, as if the tree itself approved the reckoning. Every creak, every sway, was a heartbeat, marking the rhythm of justice long delayed. The men behind Solomon exhaled together, a unified force of silent power, and the wives finally realized the system they maintained for comfort and control had been dismantled in the most profound way imaginable, without a single blow, without a shout, without a crime that could be recorded. And that understanding was heavier than any punishment. The night seemed to pulse with a rhythm older than memory itself. The torches cast fractured light across the field, illuminating the 14 masters suspended in a tableau of their own undoing. They had ruled through fear, ritual, and the quiet approval of those they thought complicit. But every rule they had enforced, every order they had backed, had been inverted against them with surgical precision. And the weight of comprehension pressed on their chests heavier than any rope ever could. The wives shifted uneasily, their lanterns flickering as their eyes drank in the scene. They had believed themselves untouchable, silent enforcers of hierarchy, subtle manipulators of obedience, the soft architects of cruelty. And yet, now they were powerless to intervene, forced to witness a reversal they had neither anticipated nor could control. The calmness of the men behind Solomon unnerved them far more than any act of violence ever could. It was the precision, the deliberate order, the unwavering focus that rendered their own power meaningless. Solomon's voice, low and deliberate, carried across the field. "Look closely. Every movement you see is not chaos. It is design. Every step, every glance, every breath is a testament to the truth you denied for so long. Authority resides in understanding, not in fear. Obedience is never earned through violence alone. It is sustained through belief. And when belief dies, so does the system." One master let out a weak, broken plea. "Stop, please. This is not justice." His voice cracked under the gravity of realization. But Solomon did not respond. There was no need. The lesson had already been delivered. The men behind him, calm and synchronized, were the embodiment of inevitability. Every subtle motion conveyed mastery. Every steady breath conveyed comprehension. They had reclaimed what had always been theirs, control over their own lives, their own minds, their own destinies. The wives exchanged glances, terror and a mingling on their faces. Their complicity, their silent enforcement, their whispered manipulations, they had all built the stage for this reckoning. And now they were spectators, powerless, forced to acknowledge that the structures they maintained had never truly served them either. The illusion of safety, the comfort of authority, had crumbled in the shadow of clarity. Solomon took a measured step forward, hand resting on the ancient bark of the oak. "History," he said, "is always written by the powerful. But power, when misused, always leaves a trace. And when those traces are understood, they can be inverted, reclaimed, and returned. Tonight, you are witnessing the inversion of generations." The ropes creaked softly, moving with the rhythm of inevitability. Every sway, every subtle motion, reminded the witnesses that control is an illusion and knowledge is the ultimate weapon. And as the men behind Solomon exhaled together in unified calm, the wives understood a truth that would haunt them forever. You cannot manipulate a mind that has remembered itself. The torches cast long, trembling shadows across the field, stretching and warping as if the earth itself were bending under the weight of revelation. The 14 masters swayed silently from the ropes, their faces pale masks of comprehension, not pain. They were beginning to understand, in the marrow of their bones, that every hierarchy, every ritual, every subtle manipulation they had relied upon for decades was now meaningless. The system they built with fear and silence had been mirrored, inverted, and returned to them by the very men they thought powerless. The wives, still clutching each other, watched with eyes wide and unblinking. The fear that gripped them was not of physical harm. It was far deeper, far older. They had been spectators and participants in the invisible machinery of cruelty, enforcing compliance without ever raising a hand. And now, that machinery had been dismantled. They were powerless witnesses to a precision, a calm, a clarity that made their own authority vanish into the night air like smoke. Solomon stepped forward, his shadow long across the soft earth, and spoke in a voice that commanded without yelling. "You believed control was permanent. You believed obedience was secured through fear. But you were only borrowing authority. True power has always resided in understanding. Obedience is never absolute. And once comprehension replaces fear, the system collapses of its own weight." The men behind him shifted slightly, in unison, a quiet demonstration of mastery. Every movement had been rehearsed in silence, every stance a statement of inevitability. No one shouted, no one struck, yet the effect was total. The masters were suspended not only by ropes, but by the full weight of the truth pressing down upon them. And the wives felt it, too, a psychic gravity pulling them toward recognition they could not deny. One of the younger masters, desperate, whispered, We can undo this. We can make it right." His voice faltered. His words were empty, meaningless, a hollow echo against the certainty of men who had reclaimed themselves. Solomon turned his gaze slowly toward him. "Undo," he said quietly. "You misunderstand. This is not punishment. It is demonstration. Every action you see is intentional. Every step, every breath, every movement is a lesson in what happens when knowledge replaces fear. And knowledge cannot be undone." The wives gasped, realization sinking like stones into their chests. They had maintained the invisible structures of cruelty. They had whispered obedience, approved punishment, enforced silence. And yet, all of it had been dismantled, revealed as fragile and temporary in the face of comprehension. Behind Solomon, the men exhaled in perfect unison, the rhythm of their calm a metronome for inevitability. The ropes swayed gently in response, a silent orchestra marking the cadence of history reclaimed. The wives understood, fully, for the first time. Control is an illusion. Power is borrowed. And the mind, once awakened, can never be imprisoned again. The field held a heavy silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves above, like whispers from centuries past. The 14 masters hung from the ropes, each one suspended between life and the unbearable clarity of truth. They had ruled for decades with fear, obedience, and subtle manipulation, but now, suspended above the ground, they were confronted by a law they had never learned, the law of comprehension. Authority is never given. Obedience is never permanent. Power belongs only to those who understand it. The wives stood back, lanterns flickering, shadows dancing across their faces. They had been silent enforcers, hidden architects of the plantation's cruelty. Their whispers, their gestures, their subtle manipulations had maintained the illusion of hierarchy. But the illusion was gone. The men behind Solomon moved with calculated precision, exuding a calmness so terrifying it rendered the wives' influence null. Control had been inverted, and the witnesses could not escape its weight. Solomon spoke, his voice low, deliberate, and piercing. Every system relies on belief. Every ritual depends on obedience. Every tyrant survives only as long as their power is unquestioned. And when belief dies, when obedience fails, the system collapses under its own weight. The younger masters stammered, trying to plead, negotiate, bargain. But the men behind Solomon did not flinch. They were not swayed by words because they had learned a lesson far deeper than fear. Strategy replaces panic. Discipline replaces chaos. Awareness replaces ignorance. They had reclaimed the power that had always been theirs, the ability to see, to act, to dictate the rhythm of reality itself. The wives' whispers grew frantic, almost imperceptible under the weight of revelation. How can they move like that? How is this possible? But the answer was undeniable. The men had remembered themselves. They had stepped outside the system that sought to contain them, and now controlled the rules of engagement entirely. Solomon's gaze swept the circle, the wives, and finally the suspended masters. "This is not vengeance," he said, "and it is not punishment. It is clarity. The clarity that comes when comprehension replaces fear, when understanding replaces obedience. Watch closely, and learn, because you will carry this with you for the rest of your lives." The ropes swayed, the torches flickered, and the night seemed to lean in. Every movement of the men behind Solomon, every silent step, every calculated breath, conveyed the message with precision. The hierarchy has been inverted, the illusion destroyed, and the consequences of understanding are irreversible. And in that moment, the wives realized a truth that would haunt them forever. You cannot manipulate a mind that has remembered itself. The night air grew heavier, as if the field itself recognized the weight of what was unfolding. The 14 masters hung silently from the ropes, their eyes wide with the dawning comprehension of a truth they had long ignored. Control was never theirs to hold. Every ritual, every law, every whispered command had been borrowed from a system they thought untouchable. And now, it had been returned to those who had always possessed the understanding to reclaim it. The wives' faces were pale in the torchlight. Their lanterns flickered, casting long, fractured shadows that mirrored the collapse of the hierarchy they had sustained. For decades, they had refined the system, twisting obedience into ritual, fear into subtle manipulation, and silence into compliance. And now, all of it had been dismantled, not by force, not by frenzy, but by precision, discipline, and clarity. Solomon stepped forward, placing one hand against the bark of the ancient oak. His voice was calm, low, and commanding. Obedience is never permanent. Authority is never given. Power is a reflection of comprehension. The men you see before you have studied the system, understood it, and returned it to its rightful place. And you, silent enforcers, bear witness to what happens when understanding replaces fear. The men behind him shifted subtly, a synchronized movement that communicated not aggression, but inevitability. Their presence alone demonstrated that the system had been inverted, that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The masters above swayed gently in the ropes, their bodies straining not from physical burden, but from the gravity of realization. Every instinct to negotiate, to plead, to regain control, was futile against the precision of minds that had reclaimed themselves. One of the wives whispered in desperation, clutching another, They move like one mind. How is this possible?" Solomon's gaze found Hayes, sharp and unflinching. "It is possible because they remember who they are. They have stepped outside the patterns you created, outside the cages you maintained. And now, their mastery is unassailable because it is rooted in awareness, not fear." A hush fell over the field. The wind stayed the branches above, causing the ropes to sway in perfect rhythm. Every creak, every motion, every shadow in the torchlight became a message. The plantation's invisible architecture had been dismantled, and comprehension had replaced coercion. The wives realized, finally, that witnessing was the punishment. There would be no escape from the truth they had helped uphold. Every lesson they thought they controlled had been inverted. Every power they assumed was theirs had been reclaimed. And in that moment, they understood the most terrifying fact of all. The mind that remembers itself cannot be enslaved again. The torches burned brighter as the first movements of the final reckoning began. The men behind Solomon shifted again, closing ranks with silent intent. Their steps were measured, deliberate, every motion a statement of precision, every breath a declaration of autonomy. The 14 masters swayed in the ropes, suspended not only by the cords but by the weight of truth pressing inexorably down on them. For decades, they had ruled with fear and ritual, never realizing that authority, built on borrowed obedience, could be dismantled without a single blow. The wives' faces were pale, lanterns trembling in their hands. They had cultivated power without ever lifting a finger, but they now understood the fragility of the constructs they relied upon. Subtlety, manipulation, ritualized cruelty, all of it had been undone in the face of understanding. Witnessing was their sentence, to see the collapse of a hierarchy they had enforced, and to know there was nothing they could do to restore it. Solomon stepped forward, his voice carrying across the night like a low drumbeat. Every system relies on belief. Every hierarchy is fragile when its foundation is ignored. You built a machine of obedience and silent approval. And yet, here it collapses, not in violence, not in frenzy, but through clarity, precision, and understanding. The younger masters groaned in the ropes, realizing that pleading, bargaining, and excuses held no power against comprehension. The men behind Solomon did not strike, they did not shout, they simply maintained the structure, a calm, deliberate, inexorable force that conveyed more authority than any whip or gun ever could. One wife whispered, almost imperceptibly, It's like they move with one mind. How can this be? Solomon's eyes met his. It is because they have remembered who they are. They understand the system you maintained, the cages you built, and the illusions you upheld. And in that understanding, they have reclaimed themselves. The wind stirred the branches, making the ropes sway in perfect rhythm, casting long, oscillating shadows across the field. Each movement became a heartbeat of inevitability, marking the cadence of history corrected. The wives realized, fully and irrevocably, that their comfort, their authority, and their subtle cruelty had never been power. They were witnesses to a system reversed, a hierarchy dismantled, and a truth they could never unsee. And Solomon's final words to them hung heavy in the night. Obedience dies where understanding begins. Watch closely, because comprehension is the only power that cannot be borrowed, stolen, or enslaved. The field was silent except for the creaking of ropes and the distant sigh of the wind. The 14 masters hung like grotesque ornaments, powerless against a reality they had never anticipated. Every instinct, every learned tactic of manipulation, every rehearsed plea for mercy, useless. The hierarchy they believed unshakable had been stripped bare, and the men behind Solomon moved with the calm precision of a force that could not be resisted, only witnessed. The wives' faces were ghostly in the flickering torchlight. They had believed themselves untouchable, safe behind the subtle architecture of obedience and expectation. Their whispers, their approval of rituals, their encouragement of cruelty, these had been their weapons, their shield. And yet now, those same tools were meaningless. They were spectators, powerless, forced to confront the truth they had buried beneath layers of comfort and denial. Solomon's voice, low and commanding, broke the quiet. You believed obedience was permanent. You believed authority could be enforced through fear and ritual. But you were only borrowing power. Understanding, precision, clarity. These are the true instruments of mastery. And the men before you now wield them effortlessly. The masters above struggled in the ropes, their bodies taut, but their terror ran deeper than muscle or bone. It was a terror born of comprehension, an understanding that every subtle system they had relied upon to maintain control had been inverted, and the men who once endured their cruelty now moved as architects of inevitability, not rage. One of the wives whispered, trembling, They've studied everything we ever did. Every command, every nuance, they understand it all. Solomon's eyes swept across the circle. Exactly. And in that understanding lies their power. Fear is temporary. Control is borrowed. Knowledge is immutable. The rope swayed gently in rhythm, casting long, oscillating shadows across the field. Every subtle movement, every synchronized shift of the men behind Solomon, conveyed a lesson the wives could not ignore. Systems crumble when comprehension replaces obedience, and those who remember themselves are never enslaved again. The younger masters hung silently, their pleading replaced with a dawning awareness. Every thought, every strategy they had relied on for decades, exposed and rendered meaningless. And the wives, forced to witness it all, felt the weight of their own complicity pressed down with crushing inevitability. In that quiet, Solomon's final words to the group cut like a blade. The mind that remembers itself cannot be commanded. Obedience is an illusion, and tonight, you have seen the truth of it. The torches burned lower now, flickering like the dying heartbeat of a world long built on fear. The 14 masters hung silently, their faces pale and stripped of arrogance. For the first time, they were fully aware that their authority had never been real. Every system they had relied on, every ritualized punishment, every whispered command, they had built a house of sand, and the tide of comprehension had swept it away. The wives clutched each other, their lanterns casting jittering shadows that trembled against the ground. They had been complicit, silent architects of cruelty, enforcers of obedience without raising a hand. And now, nothing they had done mattered. They were witnesses to the collapse of the very world they had maintained, powerless to intervene, unable to deny the truth. Solomon's voice carried through the night, measured, deliberate, and inevitable. Obedience can be engineered, rituals can be maintained, fear can be imposed. But all of it exists only as long as belief endures. Remove belief, and the hierarchy collapses. Understanding cannot be chained. Knowledge cannot be enslaved. And the men before you have reclaimed what you tried to take from them, their minds, their autonomy, their power. The men behind him shifted subtly, moving as one entity, each motion a precise demonstration of control. Not brutality, not anger, clarity. They had endured decades of subjugation and manipulation, and now their mastery was visible, undeniable, and absolute. One of the younger masters, lips trembling, whispered, "Please, this isn't. I can change." Solomon looked at him, calm and unwavering. Change is irrelevant. The system you relied upon is gone. The rules you enforced exist only in memory, and those who have remembered themselves will never obey your illusions again. The wives gasped, feeling the weight of their own complicity. Every whispered suggestion, every approval of punishment, every act of silent manipulation, it had all been part of a structure that had now been dismantled. They had been spectators, powerless, forced to witness the consequences of the world they had nurtured and refined. The rope swayed gently in the wind, casting, moving shadows across the field. Every sway, every creak, every subtle motion of the men behind Solomon was a lesson in inevitability, a rhythm of understanding that the wives could neither interrupt nor deny. And Solomon's voice, low and resolute, left them with a truth they could never forget. Power borrowed through fear is temporary. Power reclaimed through understanding is eternal. Remember this night, for comprehension cannot be chained. The night had thickened, pressing against every soul in the field. The 14 masters swayed gently from the ropes, shadows stretching long and distorted under the torchlight. Their bodies bore tension, but it was not the physical strain that terrified them. It was the clarity creeping into their minds. For the first time, they realized that obedience is never permanent, that authority built on borrowed fear is always temporary. Every subtle manipulation, every ritualized punishment, every whispered command they had enforced was now revealed as fragile, meaningless, ephemeral. The wives, still clutching each other, felt the weight of inevitability settle over them. They had believed themselves untouchable, safe in the comfort of silent enforcement. But the men behind Solomon moved with a precision that left no room for doubt, no space for negotiation, no illusion of power. The calm, deliberate movements, the steady breathing, the unwavering focus, all of it communicated one undeniable truth. The balance of control had shifted, and nothing could restore it. Solomon's voice cut through the heavy air, calm, deliberate, yet impossibly heavy. You believed obedience was absolute. You believed control could be enforced through fear and ritual. But the system you maintained was only an illusion, a borrowed authority that depended entirely on belief. Remove belief, and everything collapses. The men before you now possess what cannot be taken from them, understanding. The masters tried to speak, pleading, negotiating, bargaining for mercy, but their words were hollow echoes against the inevitability of comprehension. No movement from the men behind Solomon, no flicker of hesitation, no distraction was needed. Precision, clarity, awareness, these were weapons more potent than any whip, more absolute than any law. One wife whispered in disbelief, voice trembling, They've learned everything we ever did. Every subtle rule, every expectation. They've turned it all back on us." Solomon's gaze swept across the circle, sharp and unflinching. "Exactly. And in that understanding lies their power. Power is not given. Power is not stolen. It is remembered. And once a mind remembers itself, it cannot be commanded again. The ropes swayed in harmony with the wind, casting oscillating shadows across the field. Every movement of the men behind Solomon, every synchronized step, every calm breath was testament to mastery reclaimed, authority restored, and a hierarchy inverted. And the wives finally understood the ultimate punishment of complicity: to witness the collapse of the world you helped maintain, powerless to intervene, unable to unsee the truth of reclaimed power. The torches guttered in the rising wind, flickering like dying pulses across the trembling field. The 14 masters hung silently, their bodies suspended but their minds fully awake to the truth they could no longer escape. The power they had relied upon was an illusion, borrowed from obedience, enforced through fear, and now returned, inverted, and rendered meaningless. Every lesson they thought they commanded, every hierarchy they believed permanent, had been dismantled by men who understood the machinery of control better than anyone before. The wives stood rooted, lanterns shaking, their faces pale under the weight of realization. For years, they had whispered cruelty into the system, refined obedience into ritual, and maintained a delicate architecture of subjugation without ever touching the instruments of power directly. But they were powerless now. They were witnesses, not participants, to the reclamation of authority, to the restoration of balance, to the manifestation of clarity. And witnessing it was more terrifying than any punishment they could have imagined. Solomon's voice, calm and commanding, cut through the tension. Control exists only where comprehension does not. Obedience is borrowed. Fear is temporary. Rituals and law are fragile constructs. And the men before you have reclaimed what you were never meant to possess: autonomy, clarity, understanding. They move not through rage, but through precision, and in that precision lies true power. The younger masters dangled helplessly, their pleas swallowed by the rhythm of inevitability. Their muscles strained against the ropes, but it was not the rope that held them, it was the realization of their own impotence. Every subtle tactic they had relied upon, every manipulation, every ritualized command had been studied, inverted, and mastered by the very men they thought powerless. A wife whispered under her breath, voice trembling, "They are like one mind. How can they move like that?" Solomon's gaze swept across the circle, sharp, unwavering. They move with understanding. They have learned the patterns, the rules, the weaknesses of the system you upheld. And in mastering it, they have mastered themselves. Authority rooted in fear can be taken. Authority rooted in understanding is permanent. The ropes swayed, casting moving shadows that stretched across the field, shifting like time itself. The men behind Solomon exhaled in perfect unison, a silent declaration of inevitability. And in that moment, every witness, every wife, every master, understood the most dangerous truth of all: you cannot command a mind that has remembered itself. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead, carrying whispers of the past, of generations who had suffered in silence. The 14 masters hung from the ropes, bodies taut, but it was their minds that quivered with the full weight of realization. Fear alone had never ruled them. Obedience had never been absolute. And now, suspended between the earth and the sky, they were forced to confront a truth that had been denied to them for decades. Understanding is the only power that cannot be taken, borrowed, or broken. The wives clutched each other, lanterns flickering, shadows dancing across their faces like ghosts of the past. They had maintained the system of control with elegance and subtlety, believing themselves untouchable, safe behind their silent influence. But every gesture, every whispered command, every manipulation they had perfected was now meaningless. Witnessing the dismantling of a hierarchy they had enforced, and the calm mastery of those they had oppressed, was a punishment more absolute than any lash or chain. Solomon's voice rang out, low and deliberate, filling the space with the gravity of truth. You built obedience. You nurtured faith. You maintained rituals. But all of it is fragile. All of it is borrowed. The men, before you have reclaimed what cannot be stolen: clarity, autonomy, and understanding. They are calm because they know. They are powerful because they have remembered themselves. The men behind him shifted subtly, their movements synchronized with the precision of a single mind, a living mechanism of inevitability. Every glance, every step, every controlled breath communicated a language of authority the wives could not challenge. The masters above swayed gently, not from the ropes alone, but from the crushing weight of comprehension pressing down on them. One wife murmured, voice trembling, It's like they've studied everything we ever did, and now they've perfected it. Solomon's eyes, dark and unwavering, met his. Exactly. They have mastered the system, not through force, not through rage, but through understanding. Every rule you enforced, every expectation you demanded, they have turned it inside out. And once a mind understands itself, it cannot be commanded again. The ropes swayed in harmony with the wind, torches flickering, casting long, moving shadows across the field. Every subtle motion of the men behind Solomon was a message, a lesson, an absolute proof that control is temporary, but comprehension is eternal. And in that moment, the wives finally grasped the unbearable truth. The night had deepened, thick and suffocating, pressing against every soul present. The 14 masters swayed in the ropes, their bodies taut, their faces masks of horror and realization. They had ruled with fear and ritual for decades, yet now they understood that authority built on borrowed obedience was never real. Every subtle manipulation, every unspoken expectation, every whispered command they had relied upon had been studied, inverted, and mastered by the very men they had oppressed. The wives trembled, lanterns casting fractured light across the field. For years, they had been silent architects of the plantation's cruelty, cultivating obedience without ever raising a hand. And now, they were powerless witnesses, forced to confront the collapse of the very hierarchy they had maintained. The calm precision of the men behind Solomon rendered their influence meaningless. This was not violence. This was mastery. And it was absolute. Solomon's voice broke the silence. Calm, precise, and commanding. Authority is borrowed. Fear is temporary. Rituals, obedience, hierarchy, all of it relies on belief. Remove belief, and the structure collapses. The men before you have reclaimed what you were never meant to touch. Clarity, autonomy, understanding. And in that reclamation lies true power. The men behind him exhaled in perfect unison, their synchronized presence a living demonstration of inevitability. Every subtle motion, every deliberate breath communicated dominance without aggression. The masters above realized, too late, that no plea, no strategy, no manipulation could restore the illusion of control. The world they thought permanent had been inverted, and they were powerless to reverse it. One wife whispered, her voice barely audible, "They've become something beyond us, something we cannot touch." Solomon's gaze cut through the night, unwavering. Yes, they have remembered themselves. They have stepped outside the cages you maintained. And once a mind has done that, it cannot be commanded again. Witness this, remember this, and understand, what you have maintained for comfort and control is fragile. What they have reclaimed is eternal. The rope swayed in harmony with the wind, casting shadows that danced like specters across the field. Every movement of the men behind Solomon was deliberate, precise, a visual proof that comprehension always overrules fear, that knowledge always triumphs over obedience. And in the hushed darkness, every witness understood a truth that would echo for a lifetime. The mind that awakens cannot be enslaved, and the structure you built to command it has fallen forever. The first light of dawn began to seep over the horizon, pale and trembling, yet even in its arrival, the field remained heavy with the echoes of the night. The 14 masters still hung silently from the ropes, suspended not only by cord but by the weight of recognition, the unbearable truth of their impotence. Authority, they now understood, is never given. Obedience, they realized, is never permanent. All the rituals, the punishments, the silent enforcements, they had been illusions, borrowed from a fragile system that no longer existed. The wives stood frozen, shadows etched into their faces by the flickering torches now dimming. For years, they had participated, silently or subtly, in enforcing a hierarchy built on fear. Every whisper, every gesture, every approving glance, they had maintained a machine of subjugation. And tonight, that machine had been dismantled. Not through frenzy, not through rage, but through precision, clarity, and understanding. Their power was gone, replaced by comprehension they could neither resist nor ignore. Solomon's voice, steady and commanding, cut across the dawnlit field. Tonight, you have witnessed what few ever see. Authority is not held by the strong. It is only maintained by those who understand. Obedience is an illusion, and fear is temporary. The men before you have reclaimed what cannot be taken, their minds, their autonomy, their awareness. And in that reclamation lies ultimate power. The men behind him shifted slightly, moving as one organism, silent, deliberate, unshakable. They were no longer merely men who had been enslaved. They were living proof that comprehension, discipline, and awareness are the only forces that cannot be overturned. Every movement, every calm breath, every measured stance communicated inevitability. The masters above, their muscles taut and eyes wide, were utterly powerless against this force. Solomon's gaze swept across the field, landing on the wives. "Look at them," he said. "See what mastery without rage, clarity without violence, and understanding without compromise can do. You were spectators to a system you maintained, and in watching it dismantle, you are confronted by the truth. Power borrowed through fear always returns to those who understand it." The rope swayed gently in the morning breeze, casting long, oscillating shadows across the field. The torches burned low, flickering one final time as the wind carried the scent of earth and fire. Every subtle motion, every synchronized shift of the men behind Solomon, was a living testament. Hierarchy can be inverted, obedience can fail, and comprehension cannot be enslaved. And in that final, piercing moment of revelation, every witness, master, wife, and observer alike, understood the ultimate truth. Power taken by force can be lost. Power borrowed from fear is temporary, but power reclaimed through knowledge, understanding, and self-mastery is eternal. And once a mind remembers itself, it can never be chained again. The field fell silent. The lesson had been delivered. The hierarchy was inverted. And the memory of this night would echo across generations, unseen but unforgotten, like the heartbeat of freedom itself.